The night Emma Ashford walked 5 miles alone on a dark country road, she was wearing silk slippers. She had not planned to walk. No woman in her position ever planned to walk. She had a carriage, a fine one, with the Ashford crest painted on the door in gold and navy, the horses freshly shod, the velvet cushions still warm from the afternoon sun. She had a husband seated inside that carriage. She had every right in the world to remain exactly where she was. But rights, Emma had learned, meant very little when the man who was supposed to protect them simply looked away. So she walked. She did not cry. She did not call after the carriage as it rolled down the lane without her. She did not look at the woman now seated in her place, watching her through the small oval window with an expression that was almost but not quite a smile. Emma simply pulled on her gloves, lifted her chin and put one foot in front of the other. 5 miles, in silk slippers, in the gathering dark. And not once, not for a single step, did she allow herself to break. This is the story of what happened before those 5 miles, and what happened after. The trouble, as it so often did, began with a perfectly reasonable request. They had been traveling since morning, Emma and James, Duke of Ashford, bound for Harwick Manor where a cousin's engagement was to be celebrated over 3 days of dinners and dancing, and the particular kind of exhausting cheerfulness that only the English aristocracy could sustain for extended periods. The roads north of London were dry that September, the countryside gold and unhurried, and for the first hour Emma had almost allowed herself to believe it would be a pleasant journey. James had even spoken to her twice, once about the weather, once about the state of the North Road. She had counted it as progress. They stopped at Grantwell just past midday, a small market town with a respectable inn where the horses could be watered and the travelers could stretch their legs. Emma descended from the carriage with the assistance of Thomas, their footman, and breathed in the cooler air with quiet relief. She would order tea. She would sit somewhere that was not moving. She would compose herself for the 3 days ahead. She had just turned toward the inn's entrance when she heard James say her name. Not warmly, not with the easy familiarity of a husband calling to his wife. He said it the way he said most things to her lately, with a faint impatience, as though she were a minor matter he needed to dispose of before attending to something more important. Emma, she turned. And there, standing beside a hired coach at the far end of the courtyard, was Vivienne Marcourt. Emma had known about Vivienne for 14 months. She had never been told directly, of course she hadn't, but she was not a foolish woman, and she had not been raised to be blind. The late evenings, the particular distraction in James's eyes, the way certain names were never spoken in her presence, which only made them louder in their absence. She had assembled the truth the way one assembles an unpleasant puzzle piece by piece in private without letting anyone see her hands shake. Vivienne was beautiful in the manner of women who have always known they were beautiful, effortlessly, dangerously, with a quality of ease that made other women feel they were working too hard simply by standing in the same room. She was dressed in deep green, her dark hair arranged in the current fashion, and she was looking at James with an expression of such delighted surprise that Emma knew, with absolute certainty, that nothing about this encounter had been left to chance. "Good heavens," Vivienne said, "what a remarkable coincidence." James crossed the courtyard in 12 steps. Emma counted them. She watched them speak. She could not hear the words, but she did not need to. She had become something of an expert in reading conversations she was not meant to witness. Vivienne touched James's sleeve once briefly. James laughed, a real laugh, the kind Emma had not heard from him in months. Then he turned and he looked at Emma, and his expression shifted into something she had no good word for. Not guilt. James, she had discovered, did not experience guilt so much as inconvenience. He walked back to her with his hands clasped behind him. "It seems Miss Marcourt has found herself in a rather difficult situation," he said. "Her hired coach has thrown a wheel. The next available transport won't arrive until this evening, and she is expected at Harwick by nightfall. Emma looked at him steadily. I see. I thought. He paused, cleared his throat. It would only be decent to offer her a place in our carriage, given the circumstances. The courtyard was not empty. Thomas was standing 6 feet away, pretending to examine the horses with extraordinary focus. 2 maids from the inn had appeared at the doorway. A gentleman Emma did not know was watching from beneath the shade of the stable overhang with unconcealed interest. This was not a private conversation. It was a performance, and James, she realized, knew exactly what kind of performance it was. He was asking her to agree, publicly, to make it easy. Of course, Emma said. Something flickered across James's face. Relief, she thought, and beneath it something she might once have called shame. There is, however, a small matter of space, he continued, with Miss Marcourt's luggage. How far is the next town? Emma asked. He blinked. I beg your pardon. The next town, how far? Thomas, still pretending to look at the horses, said quietly, Ashton Crossing, my lady. 5 miles, roughly. Then I shall walk to Ashton Crossing, Emma said, and hire a separate conveyance from there. The silence that followed lasted exactly 4 seconds. She counted those as well. Emma, that's hardly. It is perfectly manageable, she said. The weather is fine. I have suitable shoes. This last part was not entirely true, but she did not allow her expression to change. Please give Miss Marcourt my regards. She did not wait for his response. She retrieved her small traveling bag from Thomas, who handed it over without meeting her eyes, and in that small, careful avoidance, Emma recognized something that felt dangerously close to sympathy. She did not want sympathy. Not here. Not where anyone could see it land. She walked to the edge of the courtyard. She heard the carriage door open behind her, heard the particular sound of Vivienne's laughter, bright and unconcerned, and then the creak and roll of wheels on the road. She did not look back. The road north was quiet, the hedgerows high on either side, the afternoon light beginning its long, slow decline toward evening. Emma's silk slippers were entirely wrong for this surface, and she knew it within the first quarter mile. By the second mile, her feet were aching. By the third, she had stopped thinking about her feet entirely and had moved on to thinking about nothing at all, which was, she had long since discovered, the most efficient way to survive things that could not be changed. The 4th mile brought clouds. Halfway through the 5th mile, she heard wheels behind her. She moved to the side of the road without turning, assuming it was a passing farmer, a local cart, someone with no connection to her situation whatsoever. She would not be the woman standing in the road looking desperately at every approaching carriage. She had some dignity left. Lady Ashford. The voice was old, unhurried, and deeply familiar. Emma turned. The carriage was larger than the Ashford one, dark burgundy with no crest, the kind of vehicle that announced wealth without announcing itself. The man leaning from the window had white hair, sharp gray eyes, and the expression of someone who had arranged this moment quite carefully and was not particularly surprised to find it going according to plan. Lord Edmund Cavendish, her mother's cousin, the man who, as far as Emma knew, had no business being on this road at all. I thought I might find you here, he said. Emma looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the carriage door he was pushing open. You were looking for me, she said. It was not a question. I was, he said. Get in, my dear. I have a great deal to tell you, and your shoes are ruined. Emma looked down at her silk slippers. Then she looked up at Lord Cavendish. And for the first time in a very long time, something in her chest loosened just slightly, just enough, and she allowed herself to be helped into a carriage by someone who had actually come to find her. The door closed behind her. Outside, the clouds opened, and the rain began. The carriage moved in silence for a while. Not an uncomfortable silence. Lord Cavendish had never been a man who felt the need to fill every moment with sound. He sat across from Emma with his hands resting on the ivory handle of his cane, watching the rain streak the windows, apparently in no particular hurry to begin whatever it was he had come to say. Emma was grateful for it. She needed the time, not to compose herself. She was already composed, had been composed since the moment she stepped out of that courtyard, would remain composed until she was somewhere entirely private and entirely alone, which was the only place she ever allowed herself to be otherwise. She needed the time to simply sit, to feel the carriage moving beneath her, to register, quietly and without drama, that her feet hurt enormously and that she was wet from the shoulders down, and that the man sitting across from her had, for reasons she did not yet understand, driven out of his way to find her on a country road. She looked at him. "You knew," she said. Lord Cavendish did not pretend to misunderstand. "I had a reasonable suspicion," he said, "of what today might look like." "How?" He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the rain came harder, drumming against the roof in long, uneven waves. "Your husband is not a careful man," he said finally. "Careful men do not allow certain situations to become visible. James has allowed this one to become rather broadly visible." Emma said nothing. "I want you to know," Cavendish continued, "that I did not come because I thought you could not manage. I came because you should not have to manage alone. There is a difference, Emma, a significant one." She looked out the window. The hedgerows had given way to open fields, and somewhere ahead, through the gray curtain of rain, she could make out the low shape of a stone building set back from the road. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Somewhere quiet," he said, "and dry." The cottage was not, strictly speaking, a cottage. It had begun as one. Emma could see that in its bones, in the low ceilings and the thick stone walls and the deep-set windows that had been built for an earlier, colder century. But someone had added to it over the years, carefully and with considerable taste, until it had become something between a farmhouse and a small manor, modest from the outside, surprisingly warm within, with good furniture and better fires and the particular smell of a house that was used and cared for rather than merely maintained. A housekeeper appeared before the carriage had fully stopped, a small, composed woman of middle age who moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been expecting them. "Mrs. Hale," Cavendish said as he descended, "Lady Ashford will need dry clothes, hot tea, and whatever you have in the kitchen, in that order." Mrs. Hale looked at Emma with an expression of such calm practicality that Emma felt, absurdly, like weeping, not from distress, from the simple relief of being looked at by someone who intended to help without requiring anything in return. "Of course, my lord," Mrs. Hale said. "Come with me, my lady. Let's get you sorted." An hour later, Emma sat by the fire in a borrowed dress that was slightly too short and entirely too comfortable, with a cup of tea that was exactly right, and felt the last of the cold leave her bones. Cavendish sat across from her, in the chair that was clearly his, worn at the armrests, angled precisely toward the fire, with a small table beside it that held a glass of port and a well-read book left face down at the spine. He had been here recently. Often, perhaps. "This is your house," Emma said. "One of them," he said. "I find I prefer it to the others, less noise." Emma wrapped both hands around her cup. The fire cracked and settled. Somewhere deeper in the house, she could hear Mrs. Hale moving about, the faint sound of something being prepared in the kitchen. "Tell me what you know," Emma said. Cavendish looked at her steadily. "What do you already know?" 14 months, she said. Perhaps longer. She was introduced to James through his friend Pemberton. I believe that much is true, though whether the introduction was accidental is another matter. She has attended at least 4 events at which James was present, and I was not invited to be aware of her attendance. She has been to Ashford House, I do not know how many times. James believes I am not aware of any of this. Cavendish said nothing for a moment. Then, "You are not angry." "I am," Emma said quietly. "I am very angry, but I have nowhere useful to put it at the moment, so I am setting it aside." Something moved in the old man's expression, something that looked, briefly, like admiration. "Your mother," he said, "did exactly the same thing. It used to terrify people." Emma looked at him. Her mother had died when Emma was 11, a quiet, gradual death that had taken far too long and left far too little behind. She did not speak of her often. There was not much to say that didn't hurt. "You knew her well," Emma said. It was not a question either. She remembered Cavendish from childhood, a tall figure at the edge of family gatherings, always watching, always slightly separate. "Better than most," he said. He set down his port glass and reached into the inner pocket of his coat. "Which is why I have been carrying this for the past 3 years, waiting to decide what to do with it." He held out a letter. Emma looked at it. The paper was old, cream-colored, slightly foxed at the edges, folded in thirds. The handwriting on the outside was her mother's. She knew it immediately, the way you know a voice before you see the face, that particular slant, that particular economy of line. It was addressed to the Duke of Ashford, not James, James's father. Emma did not take it immediately. "What does it say?" "It says," Cavendish said carefully, "that your mother and the late Duke had an agreement. Not a romantic one, I want to be clear on that point. A different kind entirely." He paused. "Your mother's family owned something the Ashford estate needed very badly. Not land, not money. Something rarer and considerably more valuable to the right people." He let the letter rest on the arm of his chair. "She agreed to give it into the Ashford family's keeping on one condition." Emma waited. "That her daughter," Cavendish said, "would be treated as what she was, not a convenience, not an arrangement, not someone to be managed and overlooked and handed out of carriages on country roads." His voice did not rise, it never rose, but something in it sharpened, the way the edge of a good knife sharpens, quietly and without ceremony. An Ashford wife, in full, with everything that entitled her to. The fire cracked. Rain ran down the windows. "James doesn't know," Emma said. "James was never told," Cavendish said. "His father died before he could be, and the solicitors who handled the original agreement were—" He paused. "Persuaded, I believe, to keep certain documents out of the official record." "By whom?" Cavendish looked at her steadily. "That," he said, "is the part that will interest you most." Emma set down her teacup. Her hands were steady. They were always steady when it mattered. "Tell me," she said. Cavendish reached into his coat again and produced a second document, newer, the paper whiter, the writing unfamiliar. He did not hand it to her. He simply held it where she could see the signature at the bottom. Emma looked at it for a long moment. The name was not one she recognized immediately, but the address beneath it was. She knew that address. She had seen it on an envelope once on James's desk, left carelessly open, one of those small, unguarded moments that wives notice and file away and never mention. It was Vivienne Marcourt's address. Emma looked up at Lord Cavendish. "She knew," Emma said, "about my mother's agreement. She knew before James and I were even married." "She has known for some time," Cavendish said, "and she has been very careful about what she did with that knowledge." Outside, the storm deepened. The windows shook faintly in their frames. Mrs. Hale appeared in the doorway to ask whether Lady Ashford would prefer soup or something more substantial, and Emma answered her politely, clearly, without her voice changing at all. But her mind was somewhere else entirely. Vivienne had not attached herself to James out of feeling, or not only out of feeling. She had done it with a purpose, a specific, calculated purpose. And she had spent months ensuring that Emma was too isolated, too overlooked, too quietly diminished to interfere with it. The carriage, the late evenings, the small, persistent humiliations that were always just small enough to be dismissed. It had not been cruelty for its own sake. It had been strategy. Emma picked up her teacup again, took a sip, set it down. "What is it that my mother gave them?" she asked. "What did she put into Ashford's keeping?" Cavendish smiled, very slightly, the way old men smile when they have been waiting a long time for exactly the right question. "Deeds," he said, "to the Harwick land." Emma went very still. Harwick, where they were all traveling, where the cousins' engagement was being celebrated this very evening, where James and Vivienne were, at this moment, seated at a long dinner table while Emma sat in a borrowed dress beside a fire. "The Harwick land that borders the Ashford estate to the north," she said slowly. "The same. The land James has been trying to acquire for the past 2 years." "The very same." "The land," Emma said, very quietly, "that Vivienne has apparently been helping him find a way to obtain." "Yes," said Lord Cavendish, "except that it was never his to obtain. It was always yours, placed in Ashford keeping for safekeeping for you. Your mother was very specific." He leaned forward slightly. "Vivienne does not want James to have the land. She wants to acquire it herself through him or around him, but ultimately for herself. And the only document standing between her and that outcome is the one your mother signed." "Which you have," Emma said. "Which I have," he agreed. Emma looked at the fire for a long time. Then she looked at Lord Cavendish, and something in her expression changed. Not dramatically, not in a way that anyone who didn't know her well would have caught. But Cavendish caught it. He had known her mother after all. "I would like," Emma said, "to go to Harwick." Cavendish raised one white eyebrow. "Not tonight," she said. "Not like this, but soon." She smoothed the borrowed skirt with one careful hand. "I have been managed and overlooked and handed out of carriages on country roads, Lord Cavendish. I think it is time I arrived somewhere on my own terms." The old man looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his port glass and raised it very slightly in her direction. "Your mother," he said, "would have said exactly that. Harwick Manor had never been a warm house. It was grand, certainly, 3 stories of pale limestone, 12 bedrooms, a formal garden that required 4 men to maintain and impressed nobody who had seen Versailles. But warmth was not something the architecture had been designed to produce. It produced scale. It produced the particular silence of large rooms with high ceilings. It produced, in those who walked its corridors for the first time, a faint sense of being watched. Vivienne Marcourt felt entirely at home in it. She stood at the window of the bedroom she had been given, the east-facing one, larger than she'd expected, which meant either that James had arranged it or that the cousin's household staff had made certain assumptions about her status, and watched the rain sweep across the formal garden in long gray sheets. Her tea was untouched. Her dinner dress was already laid out on the bed. She had 2 hours before she needed to go downstairs and be charming, and she intended to use them well. She was thinking about Emma. Not with guilt. Vivienne had made her peace with guilt some years ago, had examined it carefully, and found it to be an emotion of limited practical use. The sort of thing that slowed you down when speed was required. She thought about Emma the way she thought about most obstacles, analytically and with considerable respect. Emma Ashford was not stupid. This was the central fact that Vivienne had understood from the beginning, and the one that most people around Emma seemed to have missed entirely. They saw a quiet wife, a composed face, a woman who never raised her voice, never made demands, never required management. They mistook that steadiness for passivity, that silence for absence of thought. James had made that mistake from the beginning. Vivienne had encouraged it carefully, the way you encourage a fire to burn in a particular direction, by simply removing everything that might stop it. But Vivienne knew better. She had known better since the evening, 8 months into her arrangement with James, when she had arrived at Ashford House unexpectedly and found Emma in the library, reading. Not a novel, not the kind of decorative literature wives were expected to carry about. Emma had been reading a land registry document, cross-referencing it, In fact, with a map of the Ashford estate, both spread across the library table with the focused attention of someone who understood exactly what they were looking at. Emma had looked up, their eyes had met, and neither of them had said anything at all. Vivienne had excused herself and gone to find James, and she had spent the carriage ride home thinking very carefully about what it meant that Emma Ashford knew how to read a land registry. The answer, she had concluded, was that she needed to move faster. She had not come to James Ashford for love. She wanted to be clear about that, at least in the privacy of her own thoughts. There were women who fell into these arrangements out of feeling, out of genuine attachment, genuine longing, and those women, Vivienne had observed, almost always suffered for it. Feeling made you dependent. Dependent made you careless. Careless, in the world Vivienne inhabited, was simply another word for finished. She had come to James because James had access to something she needed. It had started with a conversation, a real one, the kind that rarely happened at dinner parties but occasionally happened afterward, when the port had been passed around twice, and the room had thinned to the people who actually mattered. A solicitor named Grantham had said something in passing, half to himself, about the Harwick land, about a peculiarity in the title documents, an arrangement made between two families some 20 years prior, an agreement that had never been properly registered and therefore could not be properly enforced. Vivienne had asked one careful question, then another. Grantham, who had been flattered by her attention and loosened by the port, had told her more than he should have. By the end of that conversation, Vivienne understood three things. First, there existed a deed signed by a woman named Margaret Ashford, née Cavendish, transferring certain land rights into the Ashford family's keeping, with specific conditions attached. Second, that deed had never been filed. The solicitor who should have filed it had instead buried it, paid. Grantham had implied with the particular imprecision of a man who did not want to be held to his words, by a party whose name he did not say aloud. Third, without that deed the land reverted, not to the Ashford estate, not to James, to whomever could establish the cleaner legal claim, and Vivienne, through a series of transactions she had been quietly arranging for the better part of 3 years, was very close to being that person. She needed only one thing more. She needed Emma Ashford to be somewhere else, somewhere peripheral, somewhere that made her easy to overlook when the legal proceedings began, so that nobody thought to ask whether the late Duchess's agreement might complicate matters. James had been easy to shape. That was not cruelty, it was observation. James was a man who wanted to be comfortable, who wanted his choices validated, who wanted the people around him to behave in a manner that did not require him to examine himself too closely. Vivienne had simply made herself into the person who provided all of that, the right word at the right moment, the right hesitation before mentioning Emma's name, just enough to plant the impression of a difficult woman without ever saying anything that could be directly cited, the right expression when James described his wife's reserve, his wife's silences, his wife's apparent indifference. "She doesn't seem unhappy," Vivienne had said once, carefully, "but she doesn't seem entirely present either, does she? As though she's always thinking about something else." James had been quiet for a moment, then he had changed the subject. But the seed had been planted, and Vivienne had learned a long time ago that seeds planted in fertile ground did not require much attention. The afternoon had gone well, better than well. The carriage moment had been impulsive, she would admit that. She had not planned to be in Grantwell. Her own hired coach genuinely had thrown a wheel, which she had taken as the kind of coincidence that occasionally offered opportunity to those alert enough to recognize it. She had not expected James to actually ask Emma to give up the carriage. She had expected him to hesitate, to find some other solution, to be, as he so often was, just barely too decent to do the worst thing available. But he had done it, he had actually done it, and Emma had gotten out. Vivienne turned from the window. She was not proud of the feeling that had moved through her when she watched Emma cross that courtyard, that small, warm flicker of satisfaction. She was not proud of it, but she did not pretend it wasn't there. She had spent 2 years carefully constructing a situation, and today that situation had produced exactly the image she needed. The Duchess of Ashford, walking away from her husband's carriage, alone in the rain, while Vivienne sat in her place. Society had a long memory for images like that. She crossed to the writing desk in the corner of the room, sat, and drew out a sheet of paper. There was a letter she needed to send, to grant them. The timing mattered now. The legal proceedings needed to begin before Emma recovered herself, before she found allies, before she thought to look too closely at documents that might tell her things Vivienne did not want her to know. She dipped the pen. She wrote quickly, precisely. In the small, clear hand she had developed specifically for correspondence she did not want misread. The matter we discussed should proceed at your earliest convenience. The complicating factor has been removed from the immediate situation. I do not anticipate obstruction. She sanded the letter, folded it, sealed it. Set it on the corner of the desk where her maid would find it. Then she sat back and allowed herself for exactly 1 moment to feel the satisfaction of a plan proceeding well. She did not think about Lord Cavendish. This was her mistake, the one she would not understand until much later, when it was considerably too late to correct it. She had known about Cavendish, of course. Emma's connection to him was a matter of family record, not difficult to trace, but Cavendish was old. Cavendish had been out of London for the better part of 2 years, living quietly in the country, attending almost nothing, visible at almost no social occasion worth noting. He had seemed, in Vivienne's assessment, to be the kind of man who had simply, gracefully, as old men sometimes did, stepped back from the world. She had not considered that stepping back from the world and withdrawing from its affairs were 2 entirely different things. She had not considered that a man could be entirely absent from society's view, while remaining entirely present in its mechanisms. She had not considered that Lord Edmund Cavendish, who had known Emma's mother since childhood, who had watched Emma grow up, who had spent 2 years in apparent retirement doing something Vivienne had never thought to investigate, might have spent those 2 years investigating her. She sealed the letter and rang for her maid. Downstairs, the first dinner bell sounded. Vivienne rose, smoothed her skirts, and went to the mirror. She examined her reflection with the practiced objectivity of a woman who had always understood her appearance as a tool, useful, well-maintained, deployed with intention. She looked well. She felt well. Everything, she told herself, was proceeding exactly as planned. 40 miles south, in a cottage that smelled of wood smoke and old paper, Lord Edmund Cavendish was reading a document he had spent 2 years and considerable personal expense obtaining. Emma sat across from him, still in the borrowed dress, her feet tucked beneath her in a manner no duchess was supposed to sit, her 3rd cup of tea growing cold at her elbow. She had been reading for an hour. She did not rush. When she finally looked up, her expression was very still and very clear. The expression, Cavendish had always thought, of someone who has just had a large and complicated thing confirmed rather than revealed. As though she had already suspected the shape of it, and was now simply seeing it in full for the first time. She forged a letter, Emma said, from me. Yes, to James's solicitor, suggesting that I had agreed in writing to release any personal claim to the Harwick proceedings. Yes, before I could have known there were any Harwick proceedings to release a claim to. Yes, Emma set the document down, smoothed it once precisely with her palm. That, she said, was a mistake. Cavendish looked at her. Not a moral mistake, Emma clarified. I mean a strategic one. If she had been content with James, with the position, with the arrangement as it stood, I might never have looked closely enough to find any of this. I was managing. I am good at managing. She paused. But she needed me gone. Genuinely gone, not just overlooked, but legally removed. And to do that, she had to put my name on a document. She looked at Cavendish with an expression of almost academic interest. My name in my absence, on a document I never signed. Which means, Cavendish said, that the document can be disproven. Which means, Emma said, that the document can be disproven. The fire had burned low. Cavendish reached out and added another log without getting up. He had developed the particular skill of fireplace management that comes from years of preferring to do things oneself. There is a clerk, he said, in the solicitor's office, a young man named Dowell who was present when the document was brought in. He was not comfortable with what he witnessed, and he has been, I believe the correct word is conflicted, for some months now. Emma looked at him steadily. You've spoken with him. I have had certain conversations, Cavendish said, in the tone of a man who had been having certain conversations his entire life and found them generally productive. And Mr. Dowell is prepared, under the right circumstances, to confirm that the letter was not delivered in the manner consistent with genuine correspondence from the Duchess of Ashford. It was hand-delivered, by a woman he did not recognize, who paid him to accept it without logging the receipt. The room was very quiet. She paid a clerk, Emma said, not with outrage, with something quieter, more deliberate, the tone of someone adding a final piece to a structure they have been building with great care. She did. Emma was silent for a moment. Then she said, Lord Cavendish, when did you first understand what she was doing? The old man considered this with the honesty it deserved. 14 months ago, he said. When I heard she had attached herself to James, I knew the name. I had encountered her professionally, you might say, some years before in connection with another matter involving disputed land rights. He looked at Emma directly. I did not warn you immediately because I did not yet have enough to be useful. I refused to bring you half a story. Emma nodded slowly. And now you have the whole one. Now, he said, I have very nearly the whole one. There is one piece remaining. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat one final time. The movement was slower than the previous ones, more deliberate, as though he had been saving this for the moment when Emma was ready to receive it. He placed a small, sealed envelope on the arm of the chair between them. Old wax, old paper, and on the outside, in a handwriting Emma did not recognize, 3 words, for my daughter. Emma looked at it for a long time. Your mother left it with me the year before she died, Cavendish said quietly. She asked me to give it to you when I thought you needed it. Not before, she was specific about that. He paused. I believe you need it now. Outside, the storm had eased. The rain was softer now, steady, quiet, patient, the kind of rain that intends to stay. Emma reached out and picked up the envelope. She did not open it yet. She simply held it in both hands, the way you hold something you have waited for without knowing you were waiting. Thank you, she said. Her voice was very steady. Don't thank me yet, Cavendish said. We still have a great deal of work to do. Emma looked up at him, and for the first time that day, perhaps for the first time in considerably longer, something in her eyes shifted. Not relief exactly. Not yet. But something adjacent to it. Something that looked, if you knew where to look, like the very beginning of a woman who has decided she is done being managed. Good, she said. James Ashford had always considered himself a reasonable man. This was not arrogance, or at least, he had never experienced it as arrogance. It was simply a baseline assessment he had arrived at through years of evidence that seemed, to him, to support the conclusion. He managed his estate competently. He treated his staff with consistent, if not excessive, consideration. He had never been deliberately cruel to anyone, had never raised his hand in anger, had never done the kinds of things that made men genuinely infamous. He was not his father, who had been cold in the particular way of men who have never needed to be warm. He was not his uncle, who had been a disaster of a different variety entirely. He was reasonable. He was fair. He was, in the small hours of the night when he examined himself most honestly, a man who had simply allowed certain situations to develop in ways he had not fully examined. This was the version of himself he carried into the Harwick dining room that evening. He did not carry it out unchanged. Dinner was 12 people, which was the worst possible number, large enough that you could not control the conversation, small enough that you could not escape it. The cousin, a pleasant, enthusiastic man named Bertram who had inherited more optimism than sense, had arranged his table with the cheerful randomness of a host who trusted that proximity would produce warmth. It sometimes did. Tonight it produced something else. James was seated between Bertram's future mother-in-law, who wanted to discuss drainage systems, and a retired colonel who had opinions about everything and information about nothing. Across from him sat two women he knew slightly and a man he didn't know at all, which meant the middle section of the table required constant management. Vivienne was 4 seats down on his left. She had entered the dining room looking precisely as she always did, composed, luminous, entirely at ease, and James had felt the familiar pull of her presence the way you feel a fire when you've been cold. He was not proud of this. He had stopped examining it closely some time ago, because examining it closely produced thoughts he did not know what to do with. The soup arrived. The conversation turned to the Harwick grounds, then to a recent bill in Parliament, then to horses. James answered questions when addressed. He made the appropriate observations. He raised his glass at the appropriate moments. He did all the things a Duke of Ashford was supposed to do at a dinner table. And somewhere around the fish course, in a gap between the colonel's opinions and Bertram's mother-in-law's drainage concerns, he became aware of something. Emma was not there. This was not a new fact. He had known Emma was not at the table, had known she was not at Harwick at all since they had arrived that afternoon, and he had made a series of mutually unsatisfying explanations to Bertram about her absence. A sudden indisposition. The rain. She would join them tomorrow, he thought. Perhaps the day after. Bertram had accepted this with the easy grace of a man who found most explanations acceptable, and James had moved on, and that had seemed to be that. But now, sitting at this table in this room, James found that his awareness of Emma's absence had changed character. It had become specific. He looked at the flower arrangement at the center of the table. It was fine. Bertram's housekeeper had done a competent job, but it was arranged in the manner of someone who knew what flowers were supposed to look like at a table without fully understanding why. The proportions were slightly wrong. The candles were spaced unevenly. There was a faint asymmetry to the whole thing that would not have been there if Emma had been involved. Emma always noticed asymmetry. She never mentioned it, she simply corrected it, so quietly that the result was visible without the effort being so. James had spent years eating at tables Emma had arranged without once thinking about the fact that they had been arranged at all. He thought about it now. The colonel said something. James responded. The fish plates were removed. He thought about Ashford House. He thought about the way it ran, not perfectly. Nothing ran perfectly, but smoothly, with the particular lack of friction that came from everything being anticipated before it became a problem. The household accounts, which James never needed to examine because they were always in order. The staff, who seemed to require almost no management because they had apparently been managed already. The visitors who arrived and found themselves comfortable without being able to say exactly why. The fires that were always the right temperature. The correspondence that was always answered. the 100 small administrative details of a large house that James had never once had to think about because thinking about them had simply not been necessary. He had not, he realized, ever wondered why. He picked up his wine glass, set it down. Across the table, one of the women he knew slightly, a Mrs. Harcourt he remembered now, married to a man in the Foreign Office, was telling a story about a journey she had taken last summer, some mishap with a carriage on a country road, and the table was laughing, and James was not listening to the story but was suddenly, sharply aware of the word carriage and of what it was connected to. He set his wine glass down with slightly more force than he intended. Nobody noticed. The story continued. The laughter rose and fell. James looked at his plate. He had told himself, in the carriage ride from Grantwell to Harwick, a version of events that was more comfortable than accurate. He had told himself that Emma had chosen to walk, that she had been, if anything, almost aggressive about it, that she had refused his suggestion of another arrangement before he had fully made it, that she was a grown woman who had made a decision he had not forced. He had told himself that her composure had been, he had actually used this word in his own internal monologue, reassuring, that if she had been truly distressed, she would have shown it. In the carriage beside him, Vivienne had said almost nothing. She had looked out the window for most of the journey, which he had interpreted as consideration for his mood. He had been grateful for it. Now, sitting in this dining room with 12 people and a slightly wrong flower arrangement, he found himself less grateful. He found himself wondering, with a precision he had not previously applied to the question, what exactly Emma's composure had looked like. He had a very good memory for faces. It was one of the few things his father had trained him in, the reading of expressions in rooms where expressions mattered. And Emma's face in that courtyard had been still, very still. Not the stillness of someone who didn't care, not the stillness of someone who was fine, the stillness of someone who was expending considerable energy on the production of stillness. He had seen that face before. He had simply never thought about what it meant. The meat course arrived. James ate without tasting it. After dinner, the men went to the library for port, and the women redistributed themselves in the drawing room, and James stood near the window with a glass he barely touched and listened to Bertram talk about his new mare, and thought about Emma walking 5 miles in silk slippers. Not the abstract fact of it, the specific image. The road north of Grantwell was not a comfortable road, he knew it. He had traveled it a dozen times. It would have been muddy in parts and rough in others and entirely without shelter for the last 2 miles before Ashton Crossing. The rain had started before he reached Harwick himself. He had watched it begin from the carriage window. Emma had been on that road in the rain, in silk slippers. He put his port glass down on the nearest available surface and pressed 2 fingers briefly to his forehead, a gesture so small that no one in the room would have noticed it, but which represented for James, who was not given to visible distress, something considerable. "Everything all right, Ashford?" Bertram asked. "Perfectly," James said. Bertram studied him for a moment with the kind of straightforward concern that was his dominant quality. "Emma not coming, then?" Margaret was asking. "She'll be here tomorrow," James said. This was not something he actually knew. "Good, good. Margaret's very fond of her, you know. Said she was the only woman at Lady Forsyth's dinner last spring who didn't spend the entire evening talking about other women." Bertram paused, apparently examining this. "I thought that was rather a good sign in a person." James said nothing. "Steady sort," Bertram continued, in the tone of a man paying what he considered a significant compliment. "Not everyone's cup of tea. Some people find her a bit quiet, I suppose. But the kind of person you'd want about in a genuine emergency, I always think. The kind who doesn't," he waved his port glass vaguely, "fall apart." James looked at him. "No," he said, "she doesn't fall apart." He excused himself shortly afterward. A headache, he said, the journey. Bertram accepted this with the same easy grace he accepted everything. James went upstairs. He did not go to his room. He went instead to the room that had been prepared for Emma, the west-facing one, the quieter one, because Emma always slept better without morning light. The housekeeper had prepared it exactly as requested. Fresh flowers, a small fire, the particular arrangement of pillows that had been noted on some list somewhere, and carried from house to house with the methodical efficiency of a well-run household. He stood in the doorway and looked at the room for a long moment. Then he went inside and sat in the chair by the window in the dark, and did something he had not done in a very long time. He thought carefully. Thomas found him there an hour later. Thomas was James's personal footman, a quiet, observant man of 50 who had been with the Ashford household since before James inherited the title, and who had the particular quality of good servants who have been somewhere long enough to see everything without appearing to see anything. He knocked, entered, set a candle on the table without being asked. He was turning to leave when James said, "Thomas." "My lord." James looked at the candle flame for a moment. "In Grantwell, this afternoon." "Yes, my lord." When Lady Ashford descended from the carriage, a pause. "Yes, my lord." "Tell me what you saw." Thomas was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone choosing what to say, but the quiet of someone deciding how honestly to say what they have already decided to say. "Her ladyship descended from the carriage without assistance," he said. "She retrieved her own traveling bag. She walked to the edge of the courtyard." He paused. "She did not look back." James absorbed this. "Was she?" He stopped, began again. "Her expression." Thomas considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "Composed, my lord," he said. "Very composed." Another pause, the kind of composed that costs something. The candle flame moved in a draft from the window. James watched it settle. "The kind that costs something," he repeated. "Yes, my lord." James was quiet for a long time. Thomas stood without moving, in the manner of a man who has learned that stillness is sometimes the most useful thing he can offer. "She was wearing silk slippers," James said finally, "for a 5-mile road." "Yes, my lord, I noticed that as well." "You should have—" James stopped, because Thomas should not have had to do anything. Thomas was a footman, not the man responsible for ensuring his wife was not abandoned on a country road in the wrong shoes. That responsibility belonged somewhere else entirely. "I'm sorry, my lord," Thomas said quietly, not for failing to act, for what he was witnessing. James looked up at him. "Don't be," he said. "That's not yours to be sorry for." Thomas nodded once, moved toward the door. "Thomas," James stopped him a final time. "Did she?" He looked at the window. The rain had eased. The grounds of Harwick were dark and still. "Did she seem frightened?" Thomas paused with his hand on the door frame. He considered this for what felt like a long time. "No, my lord," he said. "That's what I kept thinking about on the road here. She didn't seem frightened at all." He paused one final time. "She seemed decided." He closed the door behind him. James sat in Emma's chair in Emma's room, with Emma's carefully arranged pillows and Emma's preference for west-facing windows and the ghost of Emma's particular attention to everything that made a house function. And he felt, settling over him slowly and with the weight of something that had been approaching for a long time, a sensation he had no comfortable name for. Not guilt. He had told himself it was not guilt all evening. But it was something in that family, something with guilt's dimensions and guilt's particular gravity, pressing down in the specific place where he had been keeping, for quite some time now, all the things he had chosen not to examine. He reached out and picked up the candle, held it for a moment. Then he set it back down, stood, and went a fine Vivienne. Not with warmth, not with the familiar, comfortable pull he had grown accustomed to, with a question, one he should have asked a long time ago. Vivienne was in the small sitting room adjacent to the drawing room, the one the women had drifted away from as the evening wore on, leaving behind the particular debris of a gathering in retreat, abandoned embroidery, half-finished cups of tea, a novel left open on the arm of a chair. She was alone, which James suspected was not accidental. Vivienne was rarely anywhere by accident. She looked up when he entered, smiled the particular smile she reserved for him, warm and private, the smile that had always made him feel in some unexamined way that he was the only person in whatever room they occupied. He noticed tonight how quickly it appeared, how ready it was. "I thought you'd gone up," she said. "I was going to." He came into the room but did not sit. He stood near the fireplace with his hands clasped behind him, a posture Emma had once told him in the early months of their marriage made him look like he was preparing to deliver bad news. He had laughed at the time. He had not thought about it since. He thought about it now. "Vivienne," he said, "how did you know to be in Grantwell today?" She looked at him with an expression of mild, affectionate surprise. "I told you, the hired coach." "Yes," he said, "the wheel I remember." He looked at the fire. "It's a coincidence, I understand that. I simply find myself thinking about it." "James?" Her voice shifted slightly, warmer, slower, the register she used when she wanted him to stop thinking about something and start feeling something instead. He recognized it now with a clarity that was not comfortable. "You're tired. The journey was long. Come sit down." "My wife walked 5 miles in the rain," he said. The room was very quiet. "James." In silk slippers on the north road out of Grantwell, he looked at her directly. She did not complain, she did not make a scene, she simply got out of the carriage and walked. He paused, and I let her. Vivienne held his gaze with the steadiness of a woman who had navigated difficult conversations before and understood the importance of not being the first to look away. "She chose to walk," she said carefully. "You offered alternatives." "Did I?" He thought about this with genuine uncertainty. "I'm not sure I did. I'm not sure I offered anything at all, actually. I told her the situation and she resolved it, before I had to." "That is what Emma does," Vivienne said, with a gentleness that was perfectly calibrated. "She manages. She is very good at managing. It doesn't mean." "How long have you known about the Harwick land?" The question came out differently than he had planned it, more directly, with less preamble. He had not entirely intended to ask it tonight, but the evening had done something to his patience for his own evasions, and the question had simply arrived. Vivienne was still for exactly 1 beat too long. It was a small thing, a fraction of a second, the kind of pause that would have meant nothing to a man who was not, at this particular moment, paying very close attention. James was paying very close attention. "The Harwick land," she said, "in what sense?" "In the sense that I have been trying to acquire it for 2 years, he said, "and you have been helping me think through various approaches. And I find myself wondering tonight how much of what you know about that situation you have told me, and how much you have kept for other purposes." It was not a fully formed accusation. He did not yet have enough to make one. But it was the shape of an accusation, and Vivienne heard its shape clearly, and something behind her eyes changed, very slightly, very briefly, like a door opening a crack and then being firmly closed. "I think," she said slowly, "that you are exhausted and that today has been difficult, and that you are looking for somewhere to put feelings that are actually about something else." James looked at her. She was very good. He had always known she was very good. He had simply, for a long time, experienced that quality as a virtue rather than examining what it was in service of. "Perhaps," he said, "he left her there by the fire. He did not sleep well." He lay in the dark of his room at Harwick and listened to the house settle around him. The old sounds of old timber, the distant murmur of remaining staff completing their evening tasks. And he thought about the question he had asked Vivienne and the fraction of a second pause before she answered it. He thought about Emma reading a land registry document in the Ashford Library. He had walked past that scene so quickly, had filed it so efficiently under the general category of Emma doing something quiet and self-contained that required no involvement from him. But now, lying in the dark, he retrieved it and looked at it properly for the first time. Emma had been cross-referencing a land registry with an estate map. Not because Emma was the sort of woman who idly read land registries for entertainment. Emma was the sort of woman who read things because she had identified a specific reason to read them. What had she identified? He stared at the ceiling. What did Emma know that he didn't? And the larger question, the one that had been assembling itself all evening from pieces he had been refusing to look at directly, arrived at last, fully formed in the quiet of the dark room. What had he not been told? Morning came gray and cool, the storm entirely spent, the Harwick grounds washed clean and still. James came downstairs early, earlier than any other guest, which gave him the library to himself and the breakfast room to himself, and briefly, the particular quality of silence that large houses produce before they are populated. He sat in the library with coffee he didn't taste and a newspaper he didn't read. At 9:30, Bertram's butler appeared in the doorway. "A visitor, Your Grace. He says he has no appointment and offers his apologies for the hour. He asked me to give you this." He held out a card. James looked at it. Lord Edmund Cavendish. James set down his coffee cup very carefully. "Send him in," he said. Cavendish entered the library the way he entered most rooms, without hurry, without performance, with the complete ease of a man who had long since stopped needing to announce himself. He was dressed simply for travel, his white hair neat, his gray eyes moving across the room in one brief, comprehensive sweep, before settling on James with an expression of composed interest. "Ashford," he said pleasantly, "forgive the intrusion." "Lord Cavendish," James rose, extended his hand. "I confess I wasn't aware you were in the area." "I wasn't until recently." Cavendish settled into the chair across from James's with the deliberateness of a man who has chosen his seat carefully and intends to use it well. He did not accept the offer of coffee. He did not look around the room or make observations about the house or engage in any of the preliminary social negotiations that most visits of this kind required. He simply looked at James and said, "I imagine you had a difficult evening." James looked at him steadily. "I've had more comfortable ones." "Yes." Cavendish folded his hands on the head of his cane. "I thought we might speak before the rest of the house wakes. What I have to say is better said without an audience." "Then say it." Cavendish regarded him for a moment, not unkindly, but with the frank assessment of a man who has decided that kindness and directness are not mutually exclusive, and sees no reason to sacrifice the latter for the appearance of the former. "Your wife," he said, "walked 5 miles on a broken road in unsuitable shoes because you gave her seat to your mistress in front of your footman, 2 in maids, and a gentleman I have since identified as a correspondent for the Morning Chronicle." James said nothing. "By Thursday," Cavendish continued in the same level tone, "that story will have traveled to every drawing room in London, not as scandal, as a particular kind of story that women tell each other and remember for a long time." He paused. "I am not telling you this to cause you distress. I am telling you because you should know the full dimensions of what yesterday produced." "Where is Emma?" James asked. "Safe, comfortable, in better spirits than you perhaps deserve, though she has always been more generous in that regard than the situation warranted." Cavendish looked at him with something that was not quite sympathy and not quite its absence. "She is not, if that is your concern, destroyed. Emma is not easily destroyed. but she has been, for some time now, asked to absorb a great deal, and yesterday was not a small addition to that weight. James looked at the window. The grounds of Harwick were beginning to take on color as the morning light strengthened, the wet grass very green, the gravel paths dark with last night's rain. "You came here for a reason," he said, "beyond informing me of consequences I'm already aware of." "I did." Cavendish reached into his coat and produced a document. He did not hand it across immediately. He held it with the deliberateness of a man who understands that a document placed on a table changes the nature of a conversation permanently and wants to ensure the conversation is ready for that change. "What do you know about the arrangement between your father and Margaret Cavendish, Emma's mother?" James frowned. "Margaret Cavendish married a man named Holt, Emma's father." "Yes, but before that marriage and during it, Margaret maintained a separate legal identity in certain matters of property. Her family, my family, were careful about that." Cavendish paused. "What did your father tell you about the Harwick land, when he first discussed the northern boundaries of the estate?" "He said the title was complicated," James said slowly, "that there had been an arrangement with a neighboring family that hadn't been fully resolved. He intended to address it but died before he could." He paused. "I inherited the complication along with everything else." "Did he tell you what the arrangement involved?" "No." "Did he tell you who the neighboring family was?" "No." Cavendish nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something he had expected. He placed the document on the table between them. "The neighboring family," he said, "was the Cavendishes, and the arrangement," he tapped the document once lightly, "was this." James reached out and picked it up. He read it carefully. He was not a fast reader in the way that some men were fast readers. He had learned early that speed in reading, like speed in most things, produced a quantity of comprehension that was not always the same as quality. He read each clause, each condition, each precise, careful phrase that Margaret Cavendish, Emma's mother, had negotiated with his father 23 years ago. When he finished, he set it down. He did not speak immediately. "The Harwick land," he said, "the portion I've been trying to acquire, the northern section, was placed in Ashford keeping for Emma," Cavendish said. "Not for the Ashford estate, for Emma specifically. Your father agreed to hold it in trust to be transferred to her upon her marriage to you, which Margaret had arranged, in outline if not in detail, before Emma was old enough to have opinions on the matter." He paused. "The transfer was never completed. Your father died. The solicitors who knew the full terms of the arrangement were redirected." James looked up sharply. "Redirected?" "Someone ensured that the relevant documents did not enter the official estate record. Someone who understood the value of the land and had a specific interest in its availability." Cavendish looked at him with the steady patience of a man delivering news to someone who is not yet ready to receive all of it at once. "Someone who has been in a position, for the past 2 years, to shape your understanding of the Harwick situation." The library was very quiet. James heard the house beginning to wake above him, footsteps, distant voices, the sounds of a morning beginning its ordinary progress. He heard all of it from a great distance, as though the room he was sitting in had moved slightly outside the normal flow of events. "You're telling me," he said, "that Vivienne knew about this arrangement." "I am telling you that Vivienne has known about this arrangement for longer than she has known you," Cavendish said. "I am telling you that her interest in your acquaintance was not primarily personal. I am telling you that the assistance she has offered you in navigating the Harwick question has been designed, from the beginning, to navigate it in a direction favorable to her own legal claim, which she has been quietly constructing, through a series of property transactions, for the better part of 3 years. James stood up. He did not go anywhere. He simply could not, at that moment, remain seated. He stood with his back to Cavendish and his hands on the edge of the bookshelf and looked at the books without seeing them. "She used me," he said. "Not a question. the flatness of a statement being made by someone who is still in the process of understanding what it means. "She used your access, your position, and your distraction," Cavendish said, with the careful precision of a man who understands that the word distraction is doing significant work in that sentence and intends it to. "You were not her purpose. You were her method." James turned around. His face, Cavendish would later tell Emma, had done something interesting in that moment. Not collapsed. James was not the kind of man whose face collapsed, but something in it had reorganized. Something that had been arranged around a particular set of comfortable assumptions had been quietly, permanently rearranged. "There's more," James said. "It was not a question either." "There is one more thing," Cavendish said, "and it is the thing you will find most difficult." He produced the second document, the one with Vivienne's address at the bottom. He placed it on the table. "She forged a letter," he said, "in Emma's name, to your solicitor, releasing any personal claim Emma might make to the Harwick proceedings." He paused. "Before Emma could have known such proceedings existed." James looked at the document. He looked at it for a long time. When he looked up, his expression had completed its reorganization. What remained was something Cavendish recognized, had seen in various forms on various faces over a long life of difficult conversations. It was the expression of a man who has been shown, very clearly and very completely, the distance between who he thought he was and what he had actually done. It was not comfortable to look at. "There is a clerk," Cavendish said more quietly now, "named Dowell. He witnessed the letter's delivery. He is prepared to speak to what he saw." He paused. "The forgery can be demonstrated. The legal claim Vivienne has been building collapses without it." James said nothing. "Ashford," Cavendish leaned forward slightly, "I did not come here this morning to destroy you. I came because Emma deserves to have someone fight for what is hers, and because, on reflection, I thought you might prefer to be that person." He held James's gaze. "If you are the man I believe you are, underneath everything that has accumulated over the past 2 years." The clock on the library mantel marked the half-hour. Somewhere above them a door opened. Footsteps in the corridor. The house fully awake now, the day begun, the ordinary progress of things resuming all around them. James looked at Lord Cavendish. "Where is she?" he said. "She is at my cottage," Cavendish said, 40 miles south." "Is she—" He stopped, pressed his lips together, tried again. "Does she know you've come here?" "She knows I intended to," Cavendish said. "She did not ask me what I would say." "What did she say when you told her all of this?" Cavendish was quiet for a moment. Something moved in his expression, something that was, if you looked carefully, very close to admiration. "She said she wanted to go to Harwick," he said. "Not immediately, not in distress, on her own terms." He paused. "She said she had been managed and overlooked and handed out of carriages on country roads, and that she thought it was time she arrived somewhere differently." James looked at the window. The morning light was full now, the Harwick grounds bright and washed and very still. "I have things to attend to," he said quietly, "before she arrives." Cavendish rose from his chair, picked up his cane, moved toward the door with the unhurried deliberateness of a man whose work in this room is complete. At the threshold he paused. "Ashford," he did not turn around. "The 5 miles." James looked at him. "Don't explain it," Cavendish said. "Don't justify it. Don't construct a version of it that is easier to have done." He paused. "Just know what it was, clearly and entirely, before you go to her." He left. James stood in the empty library for a long time. Then he rang for Thomas. There was, as it turned out, a great deal to do. Vivienne came down to breakfast at 10 o'clock. This was her usual hour, late enough to avoid the early risers, early enough to maintain the appearance of someone with no particular reason to avoid anyone. She had slept well, which she considered a point of professional pride. Anxiety, she had long believed, was a luxury of people who had not planned carefully enough. She had planned carefully. She had nothing to be anxious about. She found the breakfast room empty except for Bertram's future mother-in-law, who was eating toast with the focused determination of a woman who had decided the day was already disappointing and intended to get through it efficiently. They exchanged the minimum required pleasantries. Vivienne poured her coffee, sat, unfolded the morning paper. She had been sitting for perhaps 4 minutes when she noticed the quality of the house. It was too quiet. Not in the way of a house still waking, she knew that quiet, had navigated it many times in many houses. This was the quiet of a house where something had already happened, where the staff had rearranged themselves around a new fact and were being very careful not to let it show. She set the paper down. She looked at Bertram's mother-in-law, who was resolutely attending to her toast. "Has something occurred?" Vivienne asked pleasantly. The woman looked up. "I'm sure I don't know," she said, in the tone of someone who was quite sure she did know and had decided not to be the one to say it. Vivienne finished her coffee, rose, and went to find James. He was not in the library. He was not in the billiard room. He was not in any of the ground floor rooms she moved through with increasing speed and decreasing composure. And speed, she reminded herself, was not what was called for here. Speed was what you did when you had lost control of something. She had not lost control of anything. She found him in the east garden. He was standing near the stone balustrade that overlooked the lower grounds, coat on, gloves on, with the posture of a man who had been outside long enough for the cold to stop bothering him. He was not alone. Thomas stood a respectful distance behind him, and beside Thomas was a man Vivienne didn't recognize, middle-aged, ink-stained at the fingers, holding a leather satchel with the careful attention of someone transporting something breakable. A solicitor, not James's usual one. Vivienne stopped walking. She stood on the garden path, 6 feet from the balustrade, and looked at the solicitor's satchel, and understood, in the particular way that very intelligent people understand things they have tried very hard not to, that the morning had already moved past the point where she could redirect it. James turned. He looked at her with an expression she had not seen before. Not cold, James was rarely cold, it wasn't his nature, but stripped of the particular warmth she had spent 2 years cultivating in him, the easy comfort, the willingness to not look too closely at things. What remained underneath was something quieter and considerably less manageable. "Vivienne," he said. "James," she kept her voice even, pleasant, the voice of a woman who has found a friend in an unexpected place and is simply stopping to say good morning. "I didn't realize you'd be outside. It's cold." "Yes," he said, "I've been talking with Mr. Finch." He indicated the solicitor without looking at him. "He's come up from London, at Lord Cavendish's request originally, but I've been speaking with him directly for the past hour." Vivienne looked at Mr. Finch. Mr. Finch looked at his satchel. "Cavendish," she said. The name came out level. She was proud of that. "He was here this morning," James said. "We had a conversation, a long one." He paused. "He brought documents." The garden was very still. The wet grass held the morning light in small, bright points. Somewhere beyond the balustrade, a bird was making a sound that seemed, to Vivienne's ears, unnecessarily cheerful given the circumstances. "What sort of documents?" she asked. James looked at her for a moment. Then he reached into his coat and produced a folded paper, and even from 6 feet away, even in the cool morning light, Vivienne recognized it. Not the specific document, she had not seen that particular copy, but she recognized its dimensions, its age, the color of the paper. Her stomach performed a movement she did not permit her face to reflect. "An agreement," James said, "between my father and Emma's mother regarding the Harwick land." He held it without unfolding it. "You've seen this before." It was not a question. He had learned overnight to stop offering her the escape of questions. James. Not the original, perhaps, but you know what it contains. He put it back in his coat. Cavendish has been thorough. I want you to understand that before we continue. Whatever version of this conversation you had planned, it starts from a position of considerably less advantage than you think. Vivienne looked at him. She made a rapid series of calculations, the kind she was very good at, fast and unsentimental, running through available positions the way a chess player runs through available moves. She could deny. She could redirect, suggest that Cavendish had a personal agenda, that his connection to Emma made him an unreliable source, that documents of that age were subject to misinterpretation. She could appeal to the past 2 years, to what they had been to each other, to the genuine feeling that had existed alongside everything else. She selected none of these. She selected, instead, the thing she almost never used, a version of the truth. I knew about the agreement, she said. Yes. Something moved through James's expression. Not surprise, he had been prepared for this. Something more like the particular exhaustion of having a thing confirmed that you had spent the night hoping might be wrong. Before you knew me, he said. Yes. Before Pemberton introduced us. Yes. The introduction was arranged, she said, by me through Pemberton. She kept her voice even, matter of fact. If this was going to be said, she would say it without flinching. Flinching served no one. I needed access to your understanding of the Harwick situation. Your father had left the documents in disarray and the legal position was unclear. I needed to understand what the Ashford estate believed it held. James was very quiet. And once you understood, he said, I began securing an alternative claim. She paused. Through legitimate property transactions, nothing I did was illegal. The letter, James said, in Emma's name. The garden was very still. Vivienne held his gaze. That, she said carefully, was a separate matter. Was it? Not a question. The flatness of a man who has run out of patience for constructions that separate things that are not actually separate. The letter was a precaution. Emma had been looking at the land registry. I wasn't certain how much she understood. I needed to ensure that her name could not be used to complicate the legal proceedings at a critical moment. You forged her signature. I drafted a document that. You forged her signature. The repetition was quiet and entirely final, on a legal document, to remove her right to property that was specifically left to her by her mother. Vivienne said nothing. There is a clerk, James said, named Dowell. And there it was. The thing she had not planned for because she had assessed Dowell and found him frightened and financially motivated and therefore manageable. She had not assessed him as someone who would speak. She had been wrong. It happened so rarely that she found, standing in this garden in the cold morning light, that she was almost distantly, academically, interested in the fact of it. I see, she said. Mr. Finch, James said without looking away from her, has the full documentation, Dowell's statement, the original agreement, a record of the property transactions you've been conducting. He paused. And a letter, the real one, the one Emma's mother left for her which Cavendish has been holding. Vivienne looked at him. She had not known about that letter. In 3 years of careful research, of thorough and methodical investigation of every relevant document and relationship, she had not known about that letter. It was, she recognized, the thing that had undone her. Not Dowell, not the agreement. The letter, the one variable she hadn't found because it hadn't been findable, because it had been sitting in the coat pocket of an old man who had spent 2 years looking precisely like someone who had simply stepped back from the world. She had underestimated Lord Cavendish. She had underestimated Emma. She had not, she realized, made the mistake of underestimating James. She had simply made the larger mistake of assuming that what he lacked in attention he lacked in principle. What happens now? She asked. James looked at her for a long moment. "Mr. Finch will explain the legal position," he said. "It is not favorable to you. The forged document voids any claim you might have established through the property transactions. Cavendish's solicitors are prepared to file the original agreement in full this week." He paused. "As for the rest, that is not something I intend to discuss in a garden." He turned to Thomas, said something quiet. Thomas nodded and moved toward the house. Vivienne watched him go. "James." She said his name, not with the warmth she usually deployed it with. She was past that now. They were both past that, and she was not the kind of woman to use a tool that has been conclusively broken. She said it simply, as a form of address, nothing more. For what it's worth, what existed between us was not entirely. "Don't," he said. She stopped. "Not because I don't believe you," he said, "but because it doesn't." He looked away briefly toward the lower grounds, the wet grass, the bright still morning. "It doesn't change the weight of anything." He looked back. "You used Emma, specifically and deliberately, for 2 years. You diminished her, isolated her, removed her from her own life by degrees, and you forged her name on a document designed to take from her the one thing her mother left her." He paused. "Whatever existed between us doesn't live in the same place as that. I can't hold them in the same hand." Vivienne looked at him. She thought, briefly and without sentimentality, that under different circumstances, in a different life, with different stakes, James Ashford might have been someone she could have respected without reservation. "No," she said quietly, "I don't suppose you can." The conversation with Mr. Finch lasted 40 minutes. Vivienne sat across from him in the small study Bertram had made available, a room that smelled of pipe tobacco and agricultural reports, entirely unsuited to the conversation it was hosting, and listened to the legal position explained with the methodical thoroughness of a man who took no pleasure in it but felt no need to soften it either. The forged document was void. Its existence, in fact, constituted grounds for a separate legal proceeding that Mr. Finch was careful not to characterize as inevitable, but also did not characterize as unlikely. The property transactions she had conducted were legitimate in themselves, but had been constructed on a foundation, the assumed availability of the Harwick land, that had now been conclusively removed. The alternative claim she had spent 3 years building was, in Mr. Finch's precise and unemotional phrasing, without basis. She listened. She asked 2 clarifying questions, both of which Mr. Finch answered accurately. She did not argue. She did not cry. She signed the document he placed before her, acknowledging receipt of the legal notification, nothing more, with her usual small, clear hand. When it was over, she went upstairs. She sat at the writing desk in the east-facing bedroom for a long time, looking at the formal garden below. The solicitor's letter she had sent to Grantham 2 days ago, the one about proceeding, the one about the complicating factor being removed, was somewhere in the London postal system, about to arrive at an address it would now be entirely useless to reach. She thought about Emma on the North Road, walking. She had watched her from the carriage window with that feeling. She had been almost proud of the warm, satisfied sense of a plan proceeding. She had watched Emma's straight back, her unhurried steps, her absolute refusal to look behind her. She had seen composure. She had seen a woman absorbing a defeat. She had not seen, had entirely failed to see, a woman who had already decided something. Vivienne sat at the desk for a long time. Then she rang for her maid and asked for her trunk to be brought down. There was nothing left here worth staying for. She left Harwick at noon. No announcement. No farewell to Bertram, who would be confused but would accept whatever explanation was eventually offered, because Bertram accepted most things. She descended the front steps with her maid behind her and her luggage loaded, and her traveling dress absolutely correct in every particular. Because whatever else was true, she had never left a house looking like someone who had been defeated. She was at the bottom of the steps when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned. It was not James. It was Thomas, standing at the top of the steps with his hands at his sides and his expression entirely neutral. "Safe journey, Miss Marcourt," he said. It was the correct thing to say. Formally correct, the sort of send-off you gave a departing guest. Miss Marcourt. Not my lady. Not the deference of a household staff member addressing a woman of acknowledged position. Just Miss Marcourt, the name she had arrived with, no more and no less. Vivienne looked at Thomas for a moment. Then she turned, walked to her carriage, and did not look back. Some habits, she thought, were worth keeping. James watched the carriage disappear down the Harwick Drive from the library window. He did not feel, watching it go, the things he had expected to feel. Not relief, not yet. Not grief exactly, though there was something in the vicinity of grief. The particular ache of understanding that a thing you had believed was real was built on a foundation you could no longer trust. He felt the ache of it without being destroyed by it, which told him something about the nature of what it had actually been. He turned from the window. On the desk behind him was a piece of paper. He had written 2 lines on it, then stopped, then started again, then stopped again, in the manner of a man who is very good at many things and has discovered that this particular thing, the thing he most needs to do, is not among them. He picked up the pen. He wrote, "Emma," then he stopped again. Thomas appeared in the doorway. "Your Grace, the carriage is ready if you'd like to go this afternoon." James looked at the paper, at the 2 words on it, at the enormous inadequacy of 2 words for everything that needed to be crossed. He set the pen down. "Yes," he said, "I'll go now." He folded the paper, put it in his pocket. He would not send it. He would bring it not to read to her, not to use as a prop in whatever conversation was coming, just to have it. The evidence that he had tried to find the words and found them insufficient and decided that insufficient words sent from 40 miles away were not what was owed. What was owed was the 40 miles. He took his coat from Thomas, paused at the library door. "Thomas," he said. "My lord. Did you know, before yesterday, did you know how bad it had become?" Thomas considered this with his usual careful honesty. "I knew that her ladyship was carrying more than she should have to," he said. "I didn't know the full extent of why." James nodded. "When we get back to Ashford House," he said, "there are going to be changes in how things are run, in how certain things are managed." He looked at Thomas directly. "I'll need your help with that." Thomas met his eyes. "Of course, Your Grace," he said. And then, very quietly, in the manner of a man offering something that goes slightly beyond the formal boundaries of his role, "I'm glad you're going." James looked at him for a moment. "So am I," he said. He walked out of the library, through the entrance hall, and down the front steps of Harwick Manor into the cool afternoon light. The carriage was waiting. He got in. The road south was clear. James watched it unspool through the carriage window. The same countryside he had traveled 2 days ago in the opposite direction. The same hedgerows and open fields and occasional farmhouse set back from the road. All of it washed clean by the storm and quietly indifferent to whatever was happening inside the vehicle moving through it. He had always found the English countryside soothing in its indifference. Today he found it simply there, which was enough. Thomas sat up with the driver. James had asked for that, had wanted the interior of the carriage to himself, which was not something he usually wanted but today felt necessary. He needed the space to think without managing his expression, which was more work than he had recently been allocating to it. He was not rehearsing what to say. He had considered rehearsing, had, in the first hour of the journey, begun to construct various versions of an opening, various careful arrangements of words that might serve as adequate approach to a conversation he had no real map for. He had abandoned all of them, not because they were wrong exactly, but because they were all, in different ways, designed to make things easier for him, to give him something to hold on to ensure that whatever happened when he arrived, he would at least have the small dignity of having prepared. Emma had not prepared to walk 5 miles. She had simply walked them. He could at least arrive without a script. He thought about the letter in his pocket. Emma. 2 words. He had sat in that library for 20 minutes and produced 2 words, and then he had understood that what he was trying to do, to compress everything that needed to be said into something small enough to send ahead of him, was both impossible and wrong. You did not send a letter for this. You did not find the comfortable distance of paper and ink and a 40-mile gap and call it sufficient. He thought about what Cavendish had said. Don't explain it. Don't justify it. Don't construct a version of it that is easier to have done. He thought about Thomas, in the courtyard in Grantwell, watching Emma cross to the edge of the road. The kind of composed that costs something. He thought about Emma in the library with the land registry. That image he had walked past so efficiently, filed so neatly, returned to now with the uncomfortable clarity of a man who has discovered that the things he walked past most efficiently were frequently the things most worth stopping for. He thought about the flower arrangement at Bertram's table. He thought about 12 years of fires at the right temperature. He thought about the way his house ran, the particular frictionless quality of it, and how he had experienced that quality as simply the natural condition of a well-maintained household, the way you experience good health as simply the absence of illness, never thinking about what produces it until it is threatened. He had not thought about what produced it. He thought about it now, for the full 40 miles. The cottage appeared through the carriage window just as the light was beginning its late afternoon decline, that particular golden hour that made even modest buildings look considered. It was larger than he'd expected from Cavendish's description. Stone walls, deep windows, a garden that had gone slightly wild at the edges in the manner of gardens that are loved but not obsessed over, smoke from 2 chimneys, a light in the downstairs window. The carriage slowed. James sat very still for a moment. Then he opened the door himself, before Thomas could come down, before anyone could assist him, and stepped out onto the gravel path. The front door of the cottage opened before he reached it. Not Emma. A small, composed woman he didn't recognize, the housekeeper, he assumed, who looked at him with the frank assessment of someone who has been told to expect a visitor and has formed opinions about that visitor in advance. "Your Grace," she said, not warmly, not coldly, with the precise neutrality of a woman who has decided to take no position until she has more information. "Mrs. Hale," he said, because Cavendish had mentioned her name and James had retained it. "Is Lady Ashford?" "In the garden," Mrs. Hale said. She held the door open. "I'll show you through." The garden behind the cottage was larger than the front suggested, a long, somewhat rambling space that ended in a low stone wall beyond which the countryside opened into fields. Someone had planted it with more enthusiasm than plan. Roses that had outgrown their stakes, lavender in long, unruly rows, an apple tree in the far corner that was old enough to have developed opinions about its own shape. Emma was standing near the apple tree. She was wearing a dress he didn't recognize, borrowed, he realized, slightly too short, in a blue that was not her usual color, and her hair was not as precisely arranged as it would have been at home. She had her back to him. She was looking at the fields beyond the wall with the stillness he had spent 2 days thinking about, the particular quality of someone who is not waiting but simply present. He stopped at the edge of the garden. He had 40 miles of thought behind him and 2 words on a piece of paper in his pocket, and the advice of a very old man ringing in his ears. And standing here in the actual fact of her, he found that all of it, all the rehearsed non-rehearsal, all the careful intention not to prepare, had produced in him something very simple. He was afraid. Not of Emma, not of her anger. He might have preferred her anger, actually, might have found it easier to stand in than what he suspected was coming. He was afraid of the distance, of how far things had traveled while he had been looking somewhere else, of the possibility that 40 miles in a carriage was not, in fact, the same as crossing what actually lay between them. "Emma," he said. She turned. He had expected, he didn't know what he had expected. Some version of what he deserved, probably. Whatever that looked like on her face. He had spent the journey steeling himself for it, which he now understood was another form of preparation, another way of making the moment about managing himself rather than actually being in it. What he had not expected was how tired she looked. Not broken, not destroyed. Cavendish had been right about that. Emma was not easily destroyed. It was perhaps the most accurate thing anyone had said about her in his recent memory. But tired in the way of someone who has been strong for a very long time without adequate reason to stop. The particular exhaustion that lives behind composed eyes and has nowhere to go because composure has become the only available mode. He had put that tiredness there. Not alone, not intentionally, but he had contributed to it consistently and over time in 100 ways he had been too comfortable to examine. He walked toward her. He did not have an opening. He did not have a careful arrangement of words. He had the 40 miles and the letter in his pocket and the specific knowledge, acquired over 2 days of thinking about nothing else, of what she had carried and why and how long she had been carrying it without being asked to set it down. He stopped 3 feet from her. "I know," he said, "that I am not here because I deserve to be. I want to be clear about that from the beginning." Emma looked at him. Her expression was very still, not the performing kind of stillness, the kind that costs something, just still, waiting. "I know what Vivienne did," he said. "Cavendish told me this morning, all of it. The agreement, the documents, the letter she forged in your name." He paused. "I know that she arranged to know me, that the past 2 years were constructed, that I was," he stopped briefly, made himself continue, "that I was useful to her, and that I was too occupied to see it." Emma said nothing. "I know about the Harwick land," he said, "what your mother arranged, what you were supposed to have from the beginning." He reached into his coat, not for the folded letter, he left that where it was. He produced instead a smaller paper folded once which he held without opening. "Mr. Finch has filed the original agreement. The land is being transferred to your name this week. It should have been done years ago. It should have been done the day we were married." Emma looked at the paper, then at him. "I also know," he said, and here his voice changed slightly, lost some of the careful structure he had been imposing on it, "that none of that is the point. The land is yours. The legal situation is being corrected. Those are facts. They're being handled. But they are not," he stopped. "They are not why I drove 40 miles this afternoon." He looked at her directly. "I drove 40 miles, he said, "because you walked 5, and because I have been trying for 2 days to understand what those 5 miles meant, what they cost you, not the physical distance." He paused, and for a moment he looked like a man who is very good at most things struggling with a specific one. The 5 miles of knowing that the person who should have said stay said nothing, of taking one step in front of the other because there was nothing else available. He paused. "I have been trying to understand what that is like, and I think I am not capable of understanding it fully. I think that is something you carry that I cannot entirely know. But I wanted you to know that he stopped again. That I am trying to know it. That I am not explaining it away or constructing a more comfortable version of it, or—" "James," Emma said. He stopped. Her voice was not warm. It was not cold. It was level. The voice of a woman who has been listening carefully and has something to say and would like to say it without waiting for a natural gap that may not come. "I know that you are trying," she said. "I can see that you are trying. And I want you to know that she paused, and something in her expression shifted, just fractionally, in the way of someone allowing themselves to feel something they have been carefully not feeling. "I have not spent the past 2 days deciding that this is finished. I want to be clear about that as well." James looked at her. "I have spent the past 2 days," she continued, "reading my mother's letter, and speaking with Lord Cavendish, and sitting in that garden and thinking about 12 years of marriage and what I know about you, the actual you, not the version that has existed for the past 2 years and what I believe is still there. She paused. I have not concluded that it isn't. Something shifted in James's chest. Something that had been braced for a long time, very tightly, eased just slightly, just enough. But Emma said. Yes, he said, I expected a but. I will not go back to what it was, she said. It was not a threat. It was not even particularly forceful. It was simply a fact, stated with the quiet certainty of someone who has had 2 days alone with herself and arrived at a very clear conclusion. Not because I am angry, I am angry. I want to be honest about that. I am quite angry, but because what it was not a marriage, James. It was a management. I managed the house, and I managed your comfort, and I managed my own feelings, and I managed the appearance of a functioning household, and I did all of it very efficiently, and she paused. You were not there. Not really. And I understood that that was partly Vivienne and partly circumstances and partly things that could perhaps have been different, but it was also you, choosing repeatedly not to look closely at things. James held her gaze. Yes, he said. I don't want to be managed around, she said. I don't want to be the person who sorts things out quietly so that other people don't have to think about them. I don't want to be, she stopped. Her voice was still perfectly steady, which he understood now to be an act of will rather than an absence of feeling. I don't want to be handed out of carriages. No, he said, you won't be. That is easy to say. Yes, he agreed. It is, I know that. He looked at her. I also know that I am standing here in your garden 40 miles from where I should have been 3 days ago, and that this is insufficient as gestures go, that this does not constitute evidence of anything except that I got in a carriage and drove here, which is a very low bar. He paused. I am not asking you to be convinced. I am asking you for time to constitute evidence, actual evidence. The kind that takes longer than one afternoon in someone else's garden. Emma looked at him for a long moment. The light in the garden was very beautiful, that golden late afternoon quality that the cottage seemed to have been positioned specifically to catch. The lavender moved slightly in a small wind. The apple tree in the corner held its complicated shape against the sky. There is something you should know, Emma said. Tell me. She reached into the pocket of the borrowed blue dress and produced a folded piece of paper, older than his, the paper cream-colored and slightly worn at the folds. She had been carrying it, he understood, since Cavendish gave it to her. My mother wrote me a letter, she said. She left it with Cavendish 20 years ago. He gave it to me 2 nights ago. She looked at the letter in her hands. She wrote it the year before she died. She had some sense, I think, of how things might go, what I might encounter. She knew the Ashford estate. She knew your father. A pause. She did not know you. What did she say? He asked quietly. Emma unfolded it. She did not read it aloud, not all of it. She looked at it for a moment in the golden light, and then she looked up at James and she said, do not let the management of a thing become a substitute for the having of it. She said, a woman who is very good at enduring things will sometimes endure things she should not, because endurance has become more familiar than the alternative. She paused. She said, if you find yourself standing in someone else's garden in a borrowed dress, that is the moment to decide what you actually want, not what you can manage, what you want. James looked at her. What do you want, Emma? He asked. It was the first time he had asked her that. In 12 years, in all the managed, efficient, frictionless 12 years, he had never asked her that specific question. He understood, asking it now, what an extraordinary omission that had been. Emma was quiet for a long moment. The wind moved through the lavender. I want, she said carefully, a husband who is present, who sees what is in front of him, who asks occasionally what I think and what I need and what I want, as you are asking now. She paused. I want to attend dinners where my name card is on the table and not the floor. I want to travel in my own carriage. I want, her voice shifted very slightly, and something in it became less constructed and more simply true. I want to be in the room with someone who is actually in the room. I will be in the room, James said. She looked at him. I know that is also easy to say, he said. I know, but I am telling you I will be in the room, I will ask, I will see what is in front of me. He held her gaze. I have spent 2 days seeing what I failed to see for 2 years. I find that I have, he stopped briefly, I find that I have a great deal of catching up to do, and I would like if you will allow it to begin. Emma folded her mother's letter. She put it back in her pocket. She looked at James Ashford, standing in Lord Cavendish's garden in his traveling coat with his hat in his hands, and the particular expression of a man who has dismantled every comfortable version of himself on a 40-mile road, and arrived with nothing left to hide behind. And she felt, beneath the anger and the exhaustion and the long accumulated weight of 2 years of being somewhere adjacent to her own life, something else. Something she had been keeping in a very small, very protected place for quite some time. She had not stopped loving him. That was the thing she had discovered in 2 days alone with herself and her mother's letter, the thing she had not expected to discover and could not, having discovered it, pretend she hadn't. She had not stopped. It had gone quiet, had been forced quiet by the years of not being seen, of managing rather than being met, but quiet was not the same as gone. She knew the difference. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, Mrs. Hale has made dinner. You should stay. Something moved across James's face. Not relief, or not only relief. Something larger and less composed, the expression of a man who has been braced for a door and found it open. Thank you, he said. Emma nodded once. Then she turned toward the cottage. She had taken 3 steps before she stopped. She turned back. James, she said. He looked at her. She held out her hand. Not in the formal way. Not the gloved, careful, public gesture of a duchess in a drawing room. Simply her hand extended in a garden in the late afternoon light. He crossed the distance between them in 5 steps. He took her hand in both of his. And Emma felt for the first time in a very long time that she was not managing anything at all. She was simply there, and so was he. The Ashford autumn dinner was, by general consensus, the finest it had been in years. This was not said loudly. The English aristocracy did not say things loudly when they could say them in drawing rooms, in careful asides, in the particular register of social observation that carried further than a shout precisely, because it was never raised above a murmur. But it was said, repeatedly, and by people whose opinions on such matters were considered reliable. The flowers were exceptional. The table was perfectly proportioned. The fires in every room were exactly the right temperature, which sounds like a small thing, and is, in fact, an enormous one. The guests moved through the evening with the ease of people who have been made comfortable without being aware of the making, which is the highest form of hospitality and the rarest, and which requires, in the person responsible for it, a quality of attention so complete that it becomes invisible. 30 people had been invited, 30 people had accepted. This was notable. The previous year's dinner, the last one Emma had organized before Grantwell, before the 5 miles, before everything, had seen 4 last-minute withdrawals and a general quality of attendance that could be described, charitably, as dutiful. People had come because they were supposed to come. They had stayed because leaving early required an excuse, and excuses required effort. Tonight, no one left early. Emma sat at the head of the table. Not the foot. The head, which was where, after some discussion that was not entirely without difficulty, it had been agreed she would sit. James had raised the subject himself. In the methodical way he had taken to raising subjects he had previously avoided, directly, with the particular care of someone who has learned that directness is not the same as bluntness, and has been practicing the difference. Emma had looked at him for a moment, and then she had said yes, and the matter had been settled, and no one at the table tonight seemed to find it anything other than entirely natural. She was wearing deep blue, her color not borrowed. Her hair was precisely as she intended it. Her name card was at the head of the table in her own handwriting, because she had written all 30 of them herself that morning, which she had always done and which, for the first time in 2 years, she had done without the particular background awareness of doing it for a household that did not fully acknowledge her presence in it. She was present. The household knew it. So did the guests. To her left sat Lord Edmund Cavendish. He had come down from the cottage specifically for the evening, a journey he had described, in the letter accepting the invitation, as not entirely inconvenient, given the occasion. He was dressed with his usual quiet precision, his white hair neat, his gray eyes moving across the table in the comprehensive sweep she had come to recognize as his primary mode of engagement with the world. He was, she had discovered over the past year, a man of considerable warmth beneath the composed exterior, but the warmth was the kind that revealed itself gradually, in small increments, to people who paid attention. Emma paid attention. He had been at the cottage when she and James had made the drive back to Ashford House. 3 days after James's arrival in the garden, 3 days of long conversations and longer silences, and the particular difficult work of 2 people deciding to rebuild something from materials that included the original structure and a clear-eyed assessment of what had been wrong with it. Cavendish had been there for some of those conversations, and absent for others, with the precise instinct of a man who knows the difference between when he is needed and when he is in the way. On the morning they left, he had stood at the cottage door and looked at Emma with the expression she now thought of as his most honest one, the one beneath the composed exterior, the one that was simply an old man who had kept a promise to a woman he had loved as a sister and was satisfied that he had kept it well. She had embraced him. He had been startled, she had felt it, the slight stiffness of a man not accustomed to being embraced. And then he had patted her back twice, with the careful deliberateness of someone performing an unfamiliar action and wanting to do it correctly. "Your mother," he had said into the middle distance above her shoulder, would have been, he had paused, she would have been very pleased. Emma had not trusted her voice for a moment. "Thank you," she had said finally, "for the 2 years, for the waiting." It was the right moment, he said. She was specific about that. He had released her, straightened, resumed his usual composed exterior as efficiently as a man putting on a coat. "Now go home," he had said. "You have a great deal to sort out." She had laughed, a real one, the kind that arrives unexpectedly and is better for it. She had gone home. Across the table, James was talking to the man on his right, a new acquaintance, someone from the Foreign Office whom Bertram had suggested inviting, and who had turned out to be genuinely interesting in the way that Foreign Office men occasionally were. James was listening with the particular quality of attention that Emma had noticed developing in him over the past year, the real kind, not the social kind. The kind that indicated actual interest in what the other person was saying, rather than management of the impression being created. He had been working at it. That was the word she would have used if asked, working. Deliberately, consistently, with the methodical application of a man who has identified a deficit and decided to address it rather than manage around it. It was not always graceful. He had asked questions that were sometimes slightly too late, made observations that were sometimes slightly off-register, arrived at things she had known for years with the slightly stunned expression of someone encountering them for the first time. She had found, to her own surprise, that she did not mind the slightly stunned expression. There was something in it, something genuine, something unperformed, that she had not previously had access to. The James who had been comfortable had been, in his way, opaque. The James who was working was visible. She could see him trying. She could see the effort and the occasional failure and the returning to try again, and she found that visible effort, imperfect as it was, more sustaining than the smooth opacity had ever been. They had argued. More than once and seriously, the kind of arguments that require willingness to stay in the room rather than retreat to the managed silence that had previously served as their conflict resolution. The first one had been genuinely terrible, the jagged kind that leaves marks. She had said things she meant. He had said things he meant. They had not resolved it in one evening, which had frightened her slightly, until she realized that unresolved arguments that continue the next morning are, in fact, a sign of two people still present in the conversation. They had continued the next morning, and the morning after that, and eventually arrived somewhere that felt, carefully and without being overstated, like solid ground. Thomas, moving behind the seated guests with the unhurried efficiency of a man entirely in his element, caught Emma's eye briefly as he refilled the glass of the woman to her right. He had been at Ashford House for 30 years. He had served James's father. He had watched James grow up, inherit, marry, and make various decisions of varying wisdom. He had stood in a courtyard in Grantwell and watched a duchess cross to the edge of a road in silk slippers, and had thought she could see it in the small nod he gave her now, the slight inclination of his head that contained several things at once, that he had known something would have to change. He was glad that something had. Emma returned the nod and turned back to Cavendish, who was telling her something about a property matter in the north that she should know about, in the manner of a man who has decided that a woman capable of reading a land registry should be kept current on relevant land registry matters. She listened carefully. She always listened carefully. The dinner ran longer than planned, which was the sign of an evening that had found its own momentum. The courses came and went. The conversation moved the way good conversation moves, without a directing hand, from one thing to another, finding its own level. At some point in the evening, during the dessert course, when the table had relaxed into the particular warmth of people who have eaten well and drunk moderately, and found each other's company more interesting than they had anticipated, Emma became aware of James looking at her. Not in the way he had looked at her across tables in the difficult years, the distracted look, the look of a man who was present in body and somewhere else in mind. This was the direct kind, the kind that knew where it was directed and intended to be there. She raised her eyebrow very slightly, the minimal expression she used when she wanted to ask a question without asking it aloud. He smiled, shook his head slightly. Nothing. Just looking. She returned to her conversation. But she felt it, that look, in the way you feel warmth from a fire when you have been cold for a long time, not dramatically, not with the stunned quality of something unexpected, simply there, steady and present and entirely intentional. After dinner, the guests redistributed, the men toward the library, the women toward the drawing room, the younger ones gravitating to the music room where someone had begun playing with more enthusiasm than precision. Emma moved between the rooms with the ease of a hostess who has organized the evening so thoroughly that it requires no further management, which was, she had come to understand, the point. Not to be indispensable in every moment, to create conditions in which the evening could run itself. She was standing near the drawing-room window in a brief pocket of quiet between conversations when she felt someone beside her, James. He had excused himself from the library early. She had seen him do it, the clean extraction of a man who has decided where he would rather be. He stood beside her at the window without preamble, looking out at the Ashford grounds in the dark. "Good evening," he said. "It is," she agreed. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the real kind, not the managed kind, the kind that does not require filling. "Cavendish looks well," James said. "He does. He told me he intends to come to London in the spring. I think he misses it more than he admits. I'll write to him. There's a matter at my club he might find interesting." A pause. "If you think he'd like that." Emma looked at him. A year ago, 2 years ago, James would not have asked. Not because he would have been unkind, but because the question would not have occurred to him. The question required the assumption that she knew something worth knowing, that her read of a person was information worth soliciting. "I think he would like that very much," she said. "He would pretend to find it a mild inconvenience, but he would like it." James nodded, filed this, would act on it. She knew that now, the way she knew other things about him that she had spent a year relearning. He followed through. That had always been true. She had simply not previously been the person he followed through for. "Emma," he said. She looked at him. He reached into his coat, produced a small velvet box, dark green, old, the kind that has been kept somewhere safe for a long time. She looked at it. "I found it," he said, "in my father's things, when I was going through the estate documents with Finch." He opened it. Inside, on a small cushion of worn velvet, was a ring, gold, simple, with a stone she recognized immediately. "It was your mother's. She gave it to my father as part of the original agreement. As a token, I think. A gesture of good faith." He paused. "It should not have stayed in a box. It should have been given to you. On the day we were married, or before, it should have been given to you, and it wasn't, and He stopped. "I am sorry for that, and for what it represents, and for every version of the same failure across 12 years. Emma looked at the ring. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked up at James, and she thought, not for the first time in the past year, but with the particular clarity of a moment that gathers everything around it, that there was something to be said for arriving late at a thing, provided you arrived. Provided you actually arrived. She held out her hand. Not the formal way, just her hand in the warm light of the drawing-room window, with 30 guests in the next room and Lord Cavendish somewhere behind her, probably watching with the precise, understated satisfaction of a man whose long plan has produced its intended result. James took her hand. He placed the ring on her finger. It fit. Of course it fit. Later, much later, when the guests had gone and the house was quiet, and Mrs. Hale's counterpart at Ashford House had supervised the clearing of the table and banked the fires and done all the things that needed doing, Emma sat in the library. Not managing, not organizing, not doing the next thing on an invisible list. Just sitting in the chair nearest the fire, with a cup of tea that had gone slightly cold and her mother's ring on her finger, and the quiet of a house at the end of a good evening around her. James came in. He had a book he was not going to read and his own cup of something and the slightly loosened look of a man at the end of a long day who has nowhere else he needs to be. He sat in the chair across from hers, the one he had begun sitting in this year, the one that had become, without either of them formally deciding it, his. They sat in silence. The fire settled. Outside, the Ashford grounds were dark and still, the autumn night cool and clear, the kind of night that makes large houses feel less large and the people in them feel less separate from each other. Emma looked at the ring. She thought about her mother, about the woman who had read land registries and made careful agreements and written letters for daughters to open in borrowed dresses in other people's gardens. The woman who had known that what was worth having was worth being specific about, worth naming. Worth insisting on, quietly, with the precision of someone who understands that the quietly and the precisely are not weaknesses. She thought about 5 miles on a dark road. She thought about a garden in golden light and a hand extended and the particular quality of a door found open. She looked up. James was watching her, the direct, intentional look, the one that knew where it was directed. She had not, she realized, stopped finding it remarkable. She suspected she would not stop finding it remarkable for quite some time, which was, she thought, exactly as it should be. She raised her slightly cold teacup in his direction. A small gesture, a private one, entirely invisible to the 30 people who had sat at her table tonight, and the world that had watched her walk out of a courtyard in silk slippers, and all the drawing rooms where the story had been told and retold, and would go on being told by women who remembered it. just the two of them in their library at the end of a good evening. James raised his cup in return. No words, none were needed. Thank you for staying with us until the very end of the story. If one of our stories touched you, tell us in the comments where you're listening from. And if you'd like to support the channel, you can join as a member or send a super thanks or super chat. Every bit of support helps us continue bringing more stories like this to life. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories.